The coastal rock of the Malian Gulf vibrated under a deafening rhythmic tremor that shook the dust from the cliffs. Over 100,000 pairs of marching feet struck the earth in unison, creating a mechanical rumble that temporarily drowned out the harsh, violent crashing of the Aegean Sea against the jagged limestone below. In 480 BC, an imperial war machine, vast enough to drink entire rivers dry, descended upon the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae. Yet, this unprecedented invasion force was completely halted, not by a massive coalition of equal scale, but by a dense wall of bronze, ashwood, and unyielding discipline wedged into a claustrophobic coastal corridor. Only 7,000 Greek hoplites stood shoulder to shoulder in the choke point, blocking the path of an empire. This was the brutal paradox of the Hot Gates. The physical space of the pass was so aggressively confined, measuring a mere 15 meters across at its narrowest points, that the overwhelming numerical superiority of the invaders instantly became a fatal liability. The larger the Persian force pushed forward into the bottleneck, the faster they bled out against an unbreakable front line. They were funneling blindly into a geographical meat grinder, where sheer human mass meant absolutely nothing against heavily armored infantry waiting in absolute silence. The air grew thick with the suffocating heat reflecting off the stones and the impending pressure of a collision that would alter military history. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today we dissect the Battle of Thermopylae. To understand how a few thousand men held off an empire, we must first look at the mind of the man who brought the world to their doorstep. 10 years after the Persian defeat at Marathon, King Xerxes I mobilized an invasion force of a scale never before witnessed in antiquity. He did not simply raise an army, he conscripted the resources of 3 continents. To move a terrestrial force exceeding 100,000 men from Asia into Europe, Persian engineers achieved an unprecedented feat of military infrastructure by lashing together hundreds of triremes and pentaconders, creating twin pontoon bridges across the treacherous waters of the Hellespont. The logistical mathematics required to sustain this invasion were staggering and unyielding. Every single day, the imperial administration had to secure vast quantities of provisions, orchestrating the movement of grain, fresh water, and forage to feed tens of thousands of regular soldiers, specialized archers, countless camp followers, and a massive cavalry corps. As the host moved steadily south through the territories of Thrace and Macedonia, they effectively stripped the landscape bare, draining entire streams dry and forcing subjugated coastal cities into ruinous debt merely to provide a single meal for the passing columns. The physical presence of this advancing vanguard was announced long before they were seen, defined by the inescapable stench of pack mules, sweat-soaked tunics, and oiled leather armor baking under the relentless sun. Miles upon miles of supply trains carved deep, permanent ruts into the earth, their slow, grinding rhythm kicking up a dense canopy of yellow dust that hovered over the plains, blanketing the air and coating the olive groves. Against this monolithic, autocratic machine of imperial conquest stood a profoundly fractured Hellenic world. The Greek city-states operated as fiercely independent, constantly feuding entities, bound together only by a shared language, common deities, and the sudden terrifying realization of imminent annihilation. The newly formed Hellenic League, spearheaded by the rigid military dominance of Sparta and the rising naval prowess of Athens, was plagued from its inception by intense, paralyzing internal divisions. Panic gripped the southern cities, prompting many prominent leaders to argue for abandoning northern and central Greece entirely to the invaders. They demanded the Allied forces retreat and fortify the narrow isthmus of Corinth, building a physical wall to prioritize the defense of the Peloponnesian Peninsula above all else. Now, however, ceding the northern territories without a fight would be a fatal strategic error. It would hand the Persian fleet uncontested safe anchorages along the coast and provide the invading infantry with the vital agricultural resources of Boeotia and Attica, allowing them to sustain a prolonged campaign against the south. A tense compromise was forged under the extreme pressure of an advancing doom. An Allied vanguard would march hundreds of miles north to establish a forward defense line, aiming to stall the invasion long enough for the combined Greek fleet to cripple the Persian navy at the Straits of Artemisium. Yet, facing a regular army of such overwhelming magnitude on an open plain meant absolute slaughter for the outnumbered hoplite formations. The Greeks knew they could not defeat this behemoth in the open field, or they needed an equalizer, and they found it in the geography of the coast. King Leonidas I of Sparta anchored this defensive line, commanding a vanguard that represented the absolute apex of heavy infantry warfare in the ancient Mediterranean world. While history often romanticizes the 300 Spartan hippes, the royal bodyguard selected specifically because they had living sons to continue their lineage, this corps of elite shock troops was heavily reinforced by roughly 7,000 allied hoplites drawn from across the Peloponnese and central Greece, including robust contingents of Arcadians, Corinthians, and Thespians. Together, they formed a unified tactical organism designed for singular, forward-moving pressure. Within the aggressively restricted confines of the Hot Gates, the Greek formation evolved from a standard battlefield tactic into a flawless, impenetrable barricade. To understand the impending slaughter, one must analyze the stark disparity in military doctrine between the two colliding forces. The Greek hoplite was effectively a walking fortress. His primary defense was the aspis, a massive, deeply bowled wooden shield faced with a heavy sheet of bronze designed to cover the soldier from chin to knee while simultaneously interlocking with the shield of the man to his left. When these 7,000 men locked ranks, they presented a continuous, unyielding wall of metal. Projecting from this bronze rampart was a dense thicket of ashwood, the dory, a heavy thrusting spear measuring over 2 meters in length, tipped with a leaf-shaped iron blade and counterweighted with a spiked bronze butt spike known as a lizard killer. The auditory intimidation of this formation was absolute. As the Greek officers barked sharp rhythmic commands, the response was a synchronized mechanical movement. The heavy coordinated thud of thousands of sandaled feet striking the rocky earth in perfect unison merged with the distinct metallic clatter of spear shafts resting against bronze shield rims. It was the sound of a human machine locking into gear, a deliberate psychological pressure broadcasted straight toward the advancing Persian lines. Opposing them was an imperial army built on an entirely different philosophy of conquest. The contingents marching at the forefront of the Persian vanguard, primarily Medes and Scythians, were engineered for mobility and ranged devastation on the open plains of Asia. Their standard tactical formation relied on a front line of soldiers carrying large rectangular wicker shields to form a defensive palisade, from behind which subsequent ranks would unleash a continuous, devastating barrage of arrows to soften the enemy before light infantry moved in for the kill. They were clad in padded linen or leather tunics, offering virtually no protection against a heavy thrusting weapon. Their own spears were significantly shorter than the Greek dory, and their sidearms were designed for slashing rather than penetrating heavy armor. This fundamental mismatch in equipment dictated the entire rhythm of the engagement, and the Persian doctrine of massed archery was immediately neutralized by the sheer density of the interlocking Greek shields and Corinthian helmets. Furthermore, the 15-meter width of the pass meant that the Persian numerical advantage was entirely irrelevant. they could only commit a fraction of their vanguard at any given moment. They were forced to abandon their mobility and engage in a head-on attritional shoving match against an enemy armored in solid bronze. In a confined forward-pressing crush, the sheer weight and leverage of the heavily armored hoplite lines acted like a physical press against the lighter-clothed infantry. Even the legendary Immortals, the elite heavy infantry of the Persian Empire, maintained at a constant strength of 10,000 men, could not alter the fundamental physics of the choke point. Though better trained and equipped with scale armor beneath their robes, their weapons were still fundamentally shorter, and their shields less durable than the massive Greek aspis. For 4 agonizing days, the two armies sat in a tense, vibrating stalemate. King Xerxes delayed his assault, observing the Greeks from his golden throne situated on a nearby rise. He assumed that the mere sight of his sprawling encampment, stretching out to the horizon, combined with the deafening noise of his assembled camp, would simply break the psychological resolve of the Hellenic defenders and force a retreat. When Xerxes finally ordered the attack after waiting 4 days, he expected the Greeks to break at the mere sight of his numbers. He was entirely wrong. The initial wave of median infantry surged into the bottleneck, initiating an engagement defined not by sweeping maneuvers, but by horrific, grinding physical pressure. Before the lines connected, a dense volley of Persian arrows rained down upon the phalanx, but the lightweight shafts simply shattered against the interlocking bronze aspis and Corinthian helmets, entirely ineffective against heavy armor. As the two masses collided, the auditory environment shifted from the roar of thousands of men to the distinct, localized trauma of shield impact and the sharp, rhythmic commands shouted by Spartan officers pacing safely behind the unbroken lines. The sheer kinetic force of the charge was absorbed by the interlocking shields, holding the line firm. The Persians found themselves physically trapped by their own colossal numbers. The men in the rear ranks, driven forward by the sting of the lash from their commanders, pushed relentlessly ahead, unknowingly crushing their own vanguard against the unyielding Greek bronze. In this hyper-compressed space, the tactical superiority of the 2-meter Greek dory became absolute. Thrusting rhythmically downward from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th ranks, the heavy ashwood spears bypassed the shorter Persian weapons entirely, striking over the tops of the flimsy wicker shields into the unarmored chests of the attackers. As the morning wore heavily into the afternoon, the very geography of the pass began to change under the tactical stress of continuous combat. The flat, manageable limestone floor disappeared beneath an accumulating chaotic mass of fallen infantry, splintered shafts, and discarded weaponry. This shifting, an unstable debris field actively hindered the lightly clad Medes and Scythians. Their soft leather footwear found absolutely no traction on the slick, treacherous footing of trampled earth, mud, and accumulating casualties, causing entire front lines to slip, stumble, and collapse under the blind forward momentum of their own advancing army. Conversely, the dense interlocking nature of the Greek phalanx allowed the defenders to maintain their footing. They leaned heavily into the massive combined weight of the formation, anchoring themselves against the earth to absorb the shock of the dying without yielding a single inch of ground. However, recognizing that the sheer volume of the enemy might eventually exhaust the front line through sheer physical exertion, Leonidas ordered an incredibly complex, semi-high-risk maneuver designed to violently exploit the Persian desperation. At a sharp, piercing command that cut through the din of combat, the Spartan contingents abruptly broke their tightly knit shield wall, turning their backs to the enemy and initiating a simulated disorganized retreat. Believing the legendary defenders had finally cracked under the relentless physical pressure, the Medes broke whatever loose tactical formation they had left, and surged forward in a chaotic sprint, abandoning all caution in their eagerness to run down the fleeing Greeks. They rushed blindly deeper into the throat of the pass, losing their footing on the uneven terrain. Then a second, perfectly timed command echoed off the cliff walls. With flawless mechanical precision drilled into them from childhood, the retreating Spartans halted and wheeled around, their heavy shields slamming back into perfect alignment, instantly reforming the impenetrable bronze barricade. The disorganized, overextended Persian vanguard slammed headlong into this sudden wall and was systematically dismantled before they could even attempt to raise their weapons. This grinding, exhausting cycle of synchronized slaughter and meticulously executed false retreats continued unabated for 2 entire days. The narrow corridor of the Hot Gates steadily consumed thousands of the great king's regular infantry, proving definitively that vast numerical superiority meant absolutely nothing when it was funneled into an impassable terrain held by disciplined heavy infantry. The Persian command structure, watching from their elevated positions, looked on in absolute disbelief as unit after unit was fed into the meat grinder, only to be repelled by a force a mere fraction of their size. Frustrated by the catastrophic losses of his regular infantry, Xerxes played his final card and unleashed his elite royal guard. Commanded by Hydarnes, the Immortals represented the apex of the Achaemenid military machine. They were a standing force of precisely 10,000 men, maintained at constant strength. Whenever one fell in combat, another immediately took his place, projecting an organized illusion of eternal invulnerability. Unlike the light infantry that preceded them, these veterans marched in strict silence, bringing a deeply ominous discipline to the blood-soaked corridor. Beneath their ornate robes, they wore overlapping iron scale armor, and they carried superior weaponry. The Xerxes deployed them with the absolute certainty that this elite corps would finally fracture the Hellenic barricade and clear the Hot Gates. Yet, as Hydarnes' vanguard collided with the Spartan front line, the fundamental physics of the battlefield remained completely unaltered. Elite status, imperial prestige, and iron scale armor could not rewrite the spatial reality of a 15-meter bottleneck. The Immortals were still forced to engage in a head-on frontal press against a heavily armored phalanx. Crucially, while their personal armor was vastly superior to the Medes, their thrusting spears were still significantly shorter than the 2-meter Greek dory. The engagement instantly devolved from a display of martial skill into a grinding, mechanical contest of leverage, reach, and tactical pressure. The Spartans did not need to outmaneuver the Immortals. They only needed to hold their ground and thrust downward. The front ranks of the Persian elite found themselves pinned against the interlocking bronze shields, utterly unable to bring their shorter weapons to bear against the Greek lines. As the Immortals pushed forward, driven by the sheer weight of the thousands of men directly behind them, they simply impaled themselves on the unyielding thicket of ashwood. The physical toll on both sides reached the extreme limits of human endurance. The air within the pass grew stagnant, dominated by the overwhelming metallic stench of spilled blood mixed with sweat-soaked leather and trampled earth. Behind the unyielding bronze wall, the heavy, labored breathing of the Greek hoplites echoed within their Corinthian helmets, while muscle fatigue set in deep as they continuously absorbed the kinetic impact of the Persian charge. Yet, the absolute rigidity of Spartan discipline prevented any collapse. When the front line grew dangerously exhausted, Spartan officers executed flawlessly timed, localized rotations, pulling tired men back and stepping fresh hoplites forward into the killing zone without ever breaking the integrity of the shield wall. For Hydarnes and his veterans, the afternoon became an agonizing lesson in tactical futility. Their superior training only ensured that they marched into the bronze press in better order than the infantry of the previous day. They fought with fanatical bravery, attempting to snap the protruding Greek spears with their hands or hack at the wooden shafts with short swords. But the depth of the phalanx was too great. Every immortal who stepped over the accumulating dead to reach the bronze front was systematically dispatched by a coordinated strike from the second or third rank. As the sun dipped behind Mount Kallidromon on the second day, the unthinkable occurred. The Immortals, the pride of the Persian Empire, broke off the engagement and withdrew. They left thousands of their dead piled high within the corridor, having failed to capture a single yard of ground. The psychological shock that rippled through the Persian command tent was profound. The realization set in that the pass could not be taken through frontal pressure, no matter how elite the troops committed to the vanguard. The frontal assault had failed entirely. The Persian army was bleeding dry against the rocks until a local man walked into Xerxes' camp with a secret. Ephialtes of Trachis possessed no grand political ambitions, only a lethal combination of precise local geographical knowledge and an overriding desire for imperial gold. He revealed to the Persian command the existence of the Anopaya path, an obscure goat track that wound its way through the dense elevated oak forests of Mount Kallidromon, completely bypassing the heavily fortified coastal choke point. Seizing this critical intelligence, Xerxes immediately dispatched Hydarnes and his surviving immortals. As night fell, the Persian elite began a rapid, grueling ascent. The environment shifted drastically from the open slaughter of the pass to the pitch-black canopy of the mountain. The tactical pressure of this maneuver was immense. Moving thousands of armored men along a narrow, uneven ridge required absolute, a disciplined silence to avoid alerting the Hellenic sentries. The auditory reality of the march was defined by the suppressed, rhythmic crunch of leather boots against loose earth, the quiet clinking of scale armor, and the occasional sharp snap of dry branches underfoot. Stationed high upon the ridge to guard this exact vulnerability were 1,000 Phocian hoplites. However, having witnessed the total focus of the Persian assaults on the coast below, they had established their camp in relative complacency. In the pre-dawn darkness, the stillness of the mountain was suddenly fractured. The Phocians were alerted not by a war horn, but by the overwhelming, approaching rustle of an entire army pushing through the heavy foliage. Scrambling in the dark, the Phocians frantically attempted to form a shield wall, on the chaotic clatter of their bronze equipment cutting sharply through the trees. Hydarnes, expecting a protracted engagement, immediately ordered his archers to loose a dense volley. The hissing rain of projectiles struck the trunks and the disorganized Greek ranks. Believing themselves to be the primary target of a massive sweeping offensive, the Phocians made a fatal tactical error. They fell back to a higher defensive position on the peak, preparing to hold the high ground. Yet, Hydarnes simply ignored them. With cold efficiency, he marched his column rapidly past their abandoned position, descending the eastern slope to emerge directly behind the main Hellenic line. Down in the coastal camp, the dawn brought catastrophic intelligence. Deserters from the Persian camp and frantic Greek scouts flooded into Leonidas's command tent and delivering the fatal news. In a single moment, the entire strategic architecture of the hot gates collapsed. The perfect geographical equalizer, the narrow funnel that had successfully nullified the Persian numerical advantage, was instantly rendered useless. The Hellenic vanguard was no longer an impenetrable blockade. They were now trapped within a vice, caught between the vast host of Xerxes to the north and the heavily armed Immortals descending from the south. the tactical reality shifted instantly from physical endurance to an impending, inescapable slaughter. The commanders in the pass understood immediately that their defensive advantage had evaporated, and the single line of retreat was rapidly closing. Surrounded and facing certain annihilation, Leonidas made a calculated, a cold-blooded command decision that would echo through millennia. Leonidas immediately grasped the tactical mathematics of the encirclement. To keep the entire Hellenic vanguard in the pass was to condemn them to total eradication. Yet, to order a full withdrawal would allow the swift Persian cavalry to pour through the hot gates and run the heavy infantry down from behind on the open plains. A deliberate, anchoring sacrifice was mathematically required. Someone had to hold the bottleneck long enough to buy the retreating columns the hours they needed to march south beyond the reach of Xerxes' horsemen. He ordered the immediate dismissal of the bulk of the allied forces. The Arcadians, Corinthians, and other Peloponnesian contingents were sent marching away before dawn, their heavy footfalls fading into the southern escape routes. Remaining with the Spartan king were the survivors of his original 300, alongside 700 Thespians under the command of Demophilus, who categorically refused the order to retreat, choosing instead to stand with the rear guard. 400 Thebans also remained, anchoring the flanks of this doomed remnant. Recognizing that survival was no longer the objective, the Hellenic commanders fundamentally altered their defensive posture. They abandoned the heavily fortified safety of the middle gate, stepping over the compacted layer of the dead, and marched forward into the wider throat of the pass. This was not a frenzied charge for glory, but a calculated maneuver designed to draw the absolute focus of the Persian command, inflicting maximum casualties to delay the pursuit. As the morning sun crested the horizon, its blinding glare reflected off a sea of advancing Persian scale armor and gold-embossed shields. The visual pressure was absolute. The Greeks were now a tiny isolated island of bronze, completely engulfed by an advancing tide of imperial infantry, pushing in from both the north and the Anopaya path to the south. When the lines collided for the final time, the violence escalated beyond the regimented shoving matches of the previous days. The Spartans and Thespians fought with a calculated recklessness, their formations deliberately looser to allow for offensive strikes. Pushing deep into the Persian ranks, they utilized the heavy dory until the ash wood finally splintered and shattered under the sheer volume of impacts against wicker, bone, and iron. Deprived of their primary reach advantage, the hoplites drew their xiphos, the short, leaf-shaped iron swords designed for brutally close combat. The regimented structure of the phalanx finally dissolved into a chaotic, desperate melee. Men engaged in localized contests of leverage, stabbing upwards beneath the armor of the Immortals. It was in this initial wider engagement that Leonidas fell. The death of a Spartan king on the battlefield triggered a violent shockwave. The combat instantly centralized around his fallen form, shifting from a strategic defense into a raw, feral struggle over the royal corpse. The Persians surged forward to claim the ultimate trophy of the campaign, seeking to decapitate the king and parade his head before Xerxes as proof of Spartan mortality. The surviving Greeks responded with an intensity that defied physical exhaustion. 4 distinct times, indeed the Persian heavy infantry managed to push the Greeks back from the body, and 4 times the hoplites countercharged, driving the Immortals away and securing their commander's remains through sheer blunt force trauma and the desperate swinging of broken shields. However, the sheer weight of numbers eventually dictated the physical reality of the ground. Pushed from the wider pass and taking fire from Hydarnes's forces descending from the rear, the surviving defenders dragged the body of Leonidas backward, retreating to a small elevated mound known as Kolonos Hill. Here, the final perimeter was formed. Their weapons were entirely degraded. Shields were split in half. Iron swords were notched and blunted against scale armor, and bronze cuirasses were dented beyond utility. The historical accounts record that in these final, desperate minutes, as their weapons failed them entirely, the men fought with their bare hands, using shattered shield rims as bludgeons, and tore at the enemy with their teeth. Watching from his throne, King Xerxes realized that sending more infantry into this concentrated pocket of desperate men would only result in further pointless attrition of his elite units. He issued a final overriding command. The Persian infantry was ordered to pull back entirely, creating a wide, silent perimeter around Kolonos Hill. The archers were brought forward in massive, overlapping ranks. For the men on the hill, the blinding morning glare was abruptly extinguished. Thousands of arrows were loosed in a continuous, overlapping barrage, creating a physical shadow that blotted out the light. The whistling volley rained down upon the mound until the last standing defender was buried beneath a layer of wood and iron. The pass was finally open, and Xerxes marched on to burn Athens, but what he left behind at Thermopylae was more dangerous than a living army. The immediate physical reality of the hot gates was reduced to absolute stillness, save for the localized shifting of debris and the hollow wind funneling through the coastal corridor. Xerxes had finally forced the pass, but the temporal and material cost was strategically ruinous. The 7-day delay at Thermopylae, 4 days of waiting, and 3 days of intense combat had completely disrupted the meticulously calculated logistics of the Achaemenid advance. Furthermore, and it provided the vital window of time required for the evacuation of Attica and the mobilization of the Allied fleet. When the Persian vanguard finally marched south and put the evacuated city of Athens to the torch, the acrid scent of burning timber rising from the Acropolis did not signal the subjugation of Hellas. Instead, it marked the culmination of a hollow victory. The psychological architecture of the conflict had fundamentally shifted. Before Thermopylae, the advancing imperial army possessed an aura of absolute invincibility, operating under the assumption that their sheer numerical mass would compel immediate submission. The stand at the hot gates shattered that illusion permanently. It proved definitively that the vast Persian war machine could be bled, stalled, and broken in close quarters engagements. The sacrifice of the rearguard catalyzed a profound ideological unification among the previously fractured Greek city-states, transforming localized panic into a unified militarized resolve. This newfound cohesion manifested in the decisive naval engagement at the Straits of Salamis shortly after, where the Allied fleet crippled the Persian navy, effectively severing Xerxes' seaborne supply lines and forcing the great king to retreat to Asia with the bulk of his forces. The following year, at the Battle of Plataea, a massive combined Hellenic army utterly annihilated the remaining Persian land forces, ending the invasion permanently. Thermopylae was an undeniable tactical defeat, an eradication of the defending forces. Yet, in the broader calculus of the war, it functioned as the strategic linchpin that saved the peninsula. Today, the physical landscape of the battlefield has drastically altered, the coastline receding kilometers away due to centuries of silt deposition. But the core mechanics of what transpired remain a foundational case study in military doctrine. It is the ultimate testament to how profound geographical exploitation, unyielding heavy infantry discipline, and a calculated command sacrifice can completely destabilize a vastly superior invading force. The legacy of Kolonos Hill is crystallized in the stone epitaph, later composed by the poet Simonides, a chillingly pragmatic final report delivered to the state. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws, we lie. If you found this historical analysis compelling, please subscribe to our channel to relive heroic chapters of history with us.